Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Michele Floriani. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Sequoia. So excited to be back with you all again for another installment of the Path Forward, the Return to Work webinar series. We've got a great topic today, a very important topic. So I'm glad to see so many folks are piling into the room. Just as a reminder, as we always do before we get going, we have some very smart and people here today who are going to give legal advice. They're going to try to translate the laws. They probably cringe when I just said legal advice. What I mean is they're going to have their opinions and insights, and they're going to try to unpack this topic for us. But you should always consult your own professional advisors and also obviously reference the latest information coming out from the CDC and public health officials and everyone else who's kind of a formal authority on this content, because the topic does change and evolve. So whether you're watching it today or watching it in a future webinar, make sure to always, reference your own resources. But I am excited about the people we have today and the topics we're going to cover. So let me take you through that right away. We'll start with some announcements from Sequoia, and I'll introduce our fantastic panel. And then Marina and Allison from Wilson Sonsini are going to take us through really the translation interpretation of Senate Bill 1159 and Assembly Bill 685, and some of the implications, of course, of not abiding by those. And so we'll kind of get the what is it, translated for us. And then our Suzette Germano, who leads our risk management practice, will take us through the workers' compensation process, so how to respond and some of the tools I think you'll be interested in learning about. And then I'll ask Steve Kim, our Chief Legal Administration Officer at Sequoia, to kind of give his own kind of employer lens on this and what it means to him and some of the things that were important to him and actually factored into his input to the Return to Work Center product. And then we'll get to see the product. I'll get Roland Ho to come up and kind of work with Steve and take us through a demo. And hopefully we have time for Q&A. Hopefully you'll use the Q&A, which will be right there, as it always is, on your menu. Everyone's in listen-only mode, so you don't have to worry about being on video or being heard or anything like that. Just sit back and enjoy. And please do use that Q&A. If we don't get to it today, we'll definitely try to get an answer back to you or factor it into future webinars, as we always do. So love your questions there. So a couple quick announcements. Fresh from Sequoia, this month we launched a new report that you may be interested, or maybe somebody on your teams. Thank you to our risk management team for producing this, really looking at how the landscape of cyber attacks and general risk management has evolved in the context of COVID, and obviously some risks with a lot of folks working from home and not in the office adds to that. So check that out. You can get that, where you can get all our insights and reports on sequoia.com resources. Just scroll down past the videos and you'll see the insights and reports section. It's there front and center. Really cool report, easy read, but useful context on the topic. One we released last October, in case you didn't see it, is the Managing a Distributed Workforce report. Really cool, lots of valuable information, as well as the one we released in August, which actually is due for a refresh coming up here. I think we'll hit that in December and try to get ready for folks in January on this topic and a lot of the others around COVID, really explaining what people are doing and how they're adapting and some of the decisions they're making on the path forward. So that and plenty more on sequoia.com, there for you to download anytime you want. I mentioned today we're going to actually get a preview, a demo of the Return to Work Center. If this is one of your first webinars, you may not have even be aware that Sequoia has a Return to Work Center solution. This is part of the reason why we started this webinar series, was to really kind of start the dialogue, get experts, and talk about how folks are approaching the return to workplace. So I'm excited to show that today. I want to just give an update. This is product, since we started, has been continuing to evolve and get more robust and more rich with its feature set. Today, we have 55 of our clients using it covering over 15,000 of their employees, 25 cities on 4 continents. The reason I'm bringing this up is because those 55 clients, I want to say a big thank you to. You've been great collaborators, giving us tons of feedback. You helped us understand where you want flexibility in the product. You helped us understand what kinds of integrations are important to you, and we're always working on that. And certainly to friends like the folks, the team at Wilson Sonsini and Steve Kim, 650, your inputs on compliance, which is such a big part of this product, has been super helpful for us to stay ahead of it. So I'm excited to show it to you later today. At any time you and your team want to check it out, we do demos every Friday and Monday. Very lightweight, go in, low stress. You know, the team behind the product helping to give the demo. You can check it out. Just access on the return to work page, that link right there, and it'll take you to this webinar. You pick the time that works, the day that works for you. And people seem to be enjoying those just because they're just really there to serve your needs as you are considering or kicking the tires on how you're going to approach your return to work. All right. So enough about that. Looks like we're ready to roll. Let's kick into our topic today, what you need to know about the Senate Bill 1159 and Assembly Bill 685, and how to respond. This is the 11th episode, if you will, webinar in this series. And it seems that we've always kind of walked through a lot of the different topics and kind of stood at the intersection of culture and policy and responding to people's needs. But inevitably, we come back to the topic we have today, which is really the obligations that are on employers' shoulders as they navigate this path forward. And we've had a couple webinars. If this is something that you're starting to now dig into, do check out the archive that we have on sequoia.com, because we've had some fantastic discussions on all aspects of the compliance landscape. Today is focused on two very important components of it, particularly for California employers. But we actually feel this is very consistent with what you'll see in other states in terms of the structure of the laws and the obligations on employers. We have a fantastic panel to walk us through the content today. Referenced them earlier, but just quickly, Marina Satalis has been a fantastic contributor to this webinar series. We've had her on the kickoff one and many since then. She'll be joined with her associate, Allison Renner, who they're going to, again, talk about what are these new laws and what do they mean to us. Suzette will talk about the process of how to respond. And Steve Kim, again, will kind of put his employer lens on, talk about how he's internalized some of these obligations in his role at Sequoia, and then how he actually did inform our product design team about some of the features and ways that that the software can help him in his role and his job protect the people and protect the company and follow through in the obligations to OSHA and the other governments. And then you'll see Roland, again, he'll give you a very hands-on under the hood look at the product itself. So that'll be the session for today. I'm excited to dig in. So without further ado, as I love to say, I'm going to hand it over to Marina to walk us through the first topic. Hi, Marina.
Hi, how are you? Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be back. Thanks for having me again, everyone at Sequoia. And I'm happy to be here to talk about these legislative developments. The first thing we'll talk about is SB 1159. So, there's this issue that I've certainly received a lot of calls from clients about, which is, how do we know if an employee contracted COVID-19 in connection with their work from the time that they spend at the workplace? And will our carrier, will our workers' compensation insurance cover it? How do we establish that it's a workplace injury, so to speak, or a sickness that they contracted or acquired in connection with their work? And along comes SB 1159. And now there is a presumption under certain circumstances that if an employee gets COVID-19 and these certain circumstances are satisfied, that it was contracted at work, such that there's a rebuttable, and we'll talk about that piece, presumption of coverage under workers' compensation. So it creates a rebuttable presumption of eligibility for workers' compensation benefits for employees who get sick or injured due to COVID-19 if they have a positive test, and that occurs during a period of an outbreak at an employee's specific place of employment. Now, specific place of employment specifically excludes, and this is important, an employee's home or residence, unless the employee performs home healthcare services at a home or residence. So for all of those employees who are working from home, that is not a place of employment for purposes of this law, of SB 1159. It does include a building, a store, a facility, an agricultural field where an employee performs services at the employer's direction. And there's certain ambiguities also. For example, what about employees who travel? If you have salespeople whose job it is to be out meeting with various customers or prospects at their work sites, for example, what is their specific place of employment? Because it's not really a building, store, a facility, or agricultural field where they're performing services at the employer's direction. What about if an employee contracts COVID while they're just traveling for work? Because there are still employees who are traveling for work at this point. So there's some ambiguities there as to the location where the employee might have gotten sick. But for most purposes, we understand the definition of place of employment to basically be your work site, to the extent that they're working there and not at home, unless they fit into certain limited exceptions. An outbreak is as listed on this slide. If within 14 days, one of the following occurs at a specific place of employment. It's different if you have 100 employees or fewer, or if you have more than 100 employees. 4 employees testing positive within 14 days if you're a smaller place of employment. If you're larger, you cross the 100 employee threshold, that's 4%, again, during that 14-day period. And these are people who test positive for COVID. It's not, I have an employee who was coughing and feverish. You're actually having a diagnosis here through testing of COVID. And the third situation is when the place of employment is ordered closed by public health officials. This law, SB 1159, applies to employers with 5 or more employees. So it applies from a very small situation, employment situation, and then there are varying degrees of coverage depending on how large you are. So I mentioned before that it's a rebuttable presumption. Well, how do you rebut the presumption? It's disputable and it can be controverted by other evidence. First of all, it requires an employee's doctor's diagnosis to be confirmed by a test. So as I mentioned, there has to be a test. The coughing, feverish employee is not going to, add for purposes of coverage under this law. The employee also has to test positive using a PCR test or any other viral culture test approved for use by the FDA. And the employer has up to 45 days to investigate and make a decision as to whether to accept or deny the claim. If the employer fails to reject or challenge the claim within 45 days, then the COVID diagnosis is presumed compensable, covered by workers' compensation. And then the employer can rebut the presumption only with evidence it discovers after the 45-day period. So if it's after acquired evidence, for example, oh, I just found out that this employee actually went to a wedding where there were 75 people and 40% of them had COVID and their family members have it. Maybe you have evidence like that an employer discovers later and says, I'm going to try with that evidence to rebut the presumption. But there will be many circumstances, I think, where an employer doesn't want to try and rebut the presumption because they want the coverage. They want the workers' compensation coverage, their insurance essentially, to cover any injury or damage that health insurance doesn't cover, for example, rather than having a situation where they're accused of negligence or somehow there is a claim against the employer to compensate the employee. You have workers' compensation preemption here and coverage for the vast majority of injury or damage that would be sustained. So strategically, employers may decide not to try and rebut the presumption in many circumstances. There's reporting requirements under 1159 as well. An employer has to notify its workers' compensation claims administrator whenever it becomes aware that an employee has tested positive for COVID-19. You have to do that within 3 business days. It has to be in writing, and there is specific information as laid out in this slide that needs to be provided to the workers' compensation claims administrator. One piece of information that is not to be provided is the name of the employee. And by now, we're sort of used to that. We know, even when we were doing just contact tracing, we never provide the name of the person who is sick. So here you're giving the date of the testing, where it occurred, and then some information on the number of employees who were working at that work site during a specific period of time. Again, as it says in the bottom, no personally identifiable information unless the employee actually goes ahead and files a workers' compensation claim, in which case they are identifying themselves. The other legislative development that's really important that we wanted to talk about is AB 685. AB 685 enacted California Labor Code section 6409.6, and it also amended other state statutes. It was signed by the governor into law in September, on September 17th, and it does a number of things. It establishes statewide occupational safety standards, specifically relating to how employers handle COVID-19 related communications to employees, and we'll go into some of these particulars here in a moment. The notification that an employer is required to provide to employees, to unions, to various health authorities under AB 685, Labor Code section 6409.6, kicks in under certain circumstances. It's when an employer receives notice of a potential exposure because someone at the work site is infectious with COVID-19 or was ordered by a public health official to isolate due to COVID-19 concerns. When that happens, the employer has 1 business day to provide written notice of exposure, not only to certain employees, but also to subcontractors and any applicable union. And we'll talk about, we'll break down these obligations here. When does the notice obligation kick in? Well, you have to have a qualifying individual. So a qualifying individual, when a qualifying individual may have exposed the workplace to COVID-19 is when they fall into one of these categories. Either they tested positive for COVID-19, a licensed healthcare professional has given the person a COVID-19 diagnosis, a public health official has issued a COVID-19 isolation type order, or the individual has actually died from COVID-19. So if you meet one of those 4 factors, one of those 4 qualifying events, you're now a qualifying individual. And that designation means you may have exposed the workplace to COVID-19. Either you tested positive, your doctor said you were positive, a public health official has issued an isolation order to you, or you actually died from COVID-19. The law now says a person who falls into one of those categories creates a potential exposure event for purposes of the workplace and COVID-19. So how does the employer know that that happened? Well, the employer has to receive notice of a potential exposure, and they can receive that notice under various circumstances. Either the public health official provides notice, the employee or the employee's emergency contact actually notifies the employer that the employee is a qualifying individual for one of those reasons. The employer may have a testing protocol, and they may find out through the testing protocol that the person tests positive. Or a subcontracted employer may notify the employer that one of their employees, a subcontracted employee, actually is a qualifying individual. So under those circumstances, you have a qualifying individual and you received notice in one of these ways that you actually have a qualifying individual. You have to now provide notice to all employees who are on site at the same work site during the infectious period. So all employees who were on site at the same work site during the infectious period. So what is the work site? It's similar to the definition we just talked about. It's the building, store, facility. I'm going to leave that agricultural field for our purposes here, or other location where the worker worked during the infectious period. And this is an important point. The work site does not include other buildings, other floors, or other locations that the employer has, but that the sick individual didn't enter. So if I work on the 40th floor and I'm a qualifying individual, but I didn't go to 39 and my employer has 39 as well, I don't have to notify those employees. So it's the building, store, facility, or other location where the sick person was, but it's not other locations of the employer where the sick employee did not enter. And the notice is to impacted employees, and it has to include certain information, the COVID-19 related benefits they're entitled to under the law, including workers' compensation information, sick leave information, COVID-related leave information. You also need to provide notice to subcontractors who may have fit these qualifications and any applicable union. You have to communicate your disinfection protocols and your safety plans. And there's also notice required to the local health authorities concerning the outbreak. Notably here, we talked about an outbreak in other circumstances being 4 people over a certain period of time. Here, so that we don't keep things consistent, it's 3 people. So employers have to notify local public health agencies of all workplace outbreaks, which are defined as 3 or more lab confirmed cases within a 2-week period. And importantly, confidentiality must be maintained. All written notifications have to be maintained, and they have to be maintained as confidential. Again, you're not revealing the name of the sick employee. And with that, we'll go to Allison, who's going to talk a little bit about what the consequences are of non-compliance and what the potential penalties and things are emanating from these legislative schemes.
Thanks, Marina. Yeah, so the logical extension, now that we've overviewed what the companies and employers' requirements are under these provisions, is what's the liability now associated with the rebuttable presumption for workers' compensation purposes, or potentially for violation of the notice requirements under AB 685. Great. So workers' compensation, there's 5 basic benefits that an employee who obtains the rebuttable presumption, they're covered under the employer's workers' compensation because there was an outbreak in the workplace and they became ill with COVID during the time period of that outbreak. So they may be entitled to medical care, which is reasonable medical related expenses, most likely that are not covered by the employee's insurance, temporary and permanent disability benefits, depending on the length of time that the individual may be disabled due to COVID related disabilities, supplemental job displacement benefits. So if an employee needs to be retrained because of their disability, they can't go back to their previous employment, they may get some vouchers for purposes of retraining, and death benefits should that employee pass. And again, that's all should be encompassed under your workers' compensation insurance plan, and something that if you have more questions with respect to the benefits that are provided, you can certainly talk to your claims administrator about how that will function. And so for AB 685, and again, this is the notice requirements to both the employees and to local health authorities if there are confirmed cases of COVID in your workplace. What are the penalties should you fail to comply with those notice requirements? Well, the law gives California OSHA enforcement authority if there are violations of these notice requirements, and they're likely going to be monetary penalties, maybe just some sort of violation fine. The AB 685 does not become effective until January 1st of next year, so we don't have examples right now of what those monetary penalties might look like. But we do have examples of California OSHA doing inspections of workplaces for COVID-19 related violations and issuing monetary penalties depending on the severity of the hazard that they uncover. So for example, let me scroll down here. There was a food processing plant that failed to socially distance workers, and they didn't install, plexiglass barriers and other things to keep employees safe from the disease, and they received a monetary fine for that. There was another company that failed to screen employees and visitors for COVID-19 related symptoms and take measures should someone exhibit such symptoms. And California OSHA issued a monetary fine with respect to that violation. And so far, we're seeing penalties ranging from about $2,000 to about $50,000, depending on the severity of the fine. So that's sort of the scope of penalties that we're seeing right now related to COVID-19 related violations. And so we can expect that we'll see similar monetary penalties when AB 685 goes into effect at the beginning of next year. So just in summary, to go over what we just said very, very quickly, we have a workers' compensation rebuttable presumption now. If there's an outbreak in the workplace and an employee gets sick, it's presumed that they were injured in the course of their work. We have to provide notice to our workers' compensation claims administrator as soon as you become aware that an employee has tested positive for COVID-19. You have to notify other employees and subcontractors who may be physically present on the work site when a qualifying individual was infectious. That notice has to contain certain information, and you should notify your local health authorities if you have 3 or more confirmed cases within a 14-day period. And that's the lay of the land.
Great. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Marina. Appreciate you guys taking us through that, always making it digestible and building blocks that even a guy like me can understand. So appreciate that. It's a skill. I want to hand it over to Suzette Germano. Again, Suzette leads our risk management practice. And also, it's a great chance for me to say we've done some workers' compensation webinars and compliance webinars throughout this series. They are there on the website. Check them out. Suzette helped us on a couple of them. Our friends from ESM. They go a little broader. Today, we're very focused in scope, but if this is something you're again digging into, please check those out. But okay, the infomercial part of that is over. Suzette, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, Marina and Allison. So much of the information that you just shared is in direct response to the questions that we've continued to receive from clients on a recurring basis. So I really think today's information is going to be very valuable. In our prior webinar on this topic, we shared a couple of tools with participants to help them when they're trying to determine if a positive COVID test meets the criteria for reporting as a workers' compensation claim to their insurer. Today, I thought we could dive into those tools a little deeper just to ensure that everyone knows how to use them. But before we even get into the tools, we've received a bunch of questions from clients on the process for reporting COVID-related workers' compensation claims. So I thought we could do maybe just a quick review of kind of the general process. While there is a ton of new information that's coming to employers regarding compliance and reporting requirements, the good news is that reporting workers' compensation claims to insurers hasn't changed that much. And the process is familiar to most employers. And that's a pretty good place for you to start if you're not sure what to do first. Whenever there is a workplace injury or illness, it's the obligation of the employer to investigate the claim and report it to their insurer. Determining who, what, when, and how are kind of the basics of all workers' compensation claims reports, and that's really no different for COVID-related claims. When faced with a positive COVID test and an employee who may have contracted the virus in the course and scope of their employment, you'll need to provide the required DWC-1 claim form for California employees. You'll want to gather as much information as possible about how that employee was exposed and complete the employer's first report of injury. And we've kind of, grabbed these here. These are all forms that are available to you as an employer. You can find these through the Department of Insurance in workers' compensation. If you believe that the positive COVID test is, maybe not industrial in nature, it's advisable when you're completing the employer's first report of injury to state all of the exposure mitigations your organization has developed to reduce exposure or contain viral spread, and or the employee's non-occupational activities that may have enhanced their risk of contracting COVID. It's important to note that when determining whether a reported claim will qualify for benefits under a workers' compensation policy, it's not the role of the employer, but the role of the insurance company to make that determination. Employees who filed workers' compensation claims related to COVID should be advised by the employer that they will be contacted by the insurer with either an acceptance of that claim or a denial based on the investigation that's completed by the insurance company. And the positive test reporting form that we've shared previously and is shown here should be used to track all on-site or work-site workers who obtain a positive test, regardless of how they were exposed to the virus. That means all positive tests must be tracked and reported, regardless of whether they're filing a workers' compensation claim and regardless of whether they actually believe that they've come in contact with someone at work. So if somebody's been, kind of coming into the office and also living their regular life, has tested positive, those are going to be the things that you're going to report back to your insurance company on the positive test form. There have also been a ton of questions, and Marina covered this a bit, about whether or not employees who have been working at home exclusively but also test positive need to be reported to the insurance company as a positive test. And the answer to that is no. Only positive tests for individuals who've had in-person contact with other staff should be reported to the claims administrator for purposes of consideration for workers' compensation outbreak tracing. On this page, we've kind of put together this cheat sheet on COVID presumption, and it's a decision tree that you can walk through to give you some information about how this may be evaluated. And on this first page, as you begin gathering information about the positive test that has been reported to you, and assessing whether the exposure may have occurred in the workplace, using this tool can help you ensure, one, that you've asked the right questions of the employee who's ill, and have provided the information in your report to the claims administrator. As we look at this first page of the flow chart, the key determinants to presumptive coverage for workers' compensation begins at the top by answering kind of that question that we've already talked about, of whether the employees worked outside of the home. If the answer is no, there's no presumption of coverage under workers' compensation. If yes, you'll need to identify if they were exposed at the workplace prior to July 5th of this year, and if you can answer yes to that, you'll move on to the executive order page to identify whether they've met the criteria for coverage for exposures occurring prior to July 5th. If the exposure occurred after July 5th and the employee is not a frontline healthcare worker, a firefighter, or a police officer, you'll follow the flowchart on to the outbreak path. This part of the flowchart outlines the current criteria for presumptive coverage, and by answering the questions shown, it'll provide an indication of how the claim may be evaluated by the claims adjuster. As Marina mentioned, for presumption to occur, the outbreak criteria must be met with regard to the number of employees per 100 or percentage in that on-site space. Just keep in mind, the flowchart is meant to be used as an instructive tool and shouldn't be used as a method for the employer to deny a claim or refuse to submit a claim on behalf of their employee. And then on the last page, you'll see the positive test tracking form that I referenced earlier. And again, regardless of causation, all positive tests for California employees or where a California employee may have been exposed by someone from maybe even another state should be tracked here and provided to your claims administrator. This form does not ask for the name of the employee who's tested positive, rather just the date of the positive test, the locations worked, and the highest number of potentially exposed staff are the key data points that you'll want to provide to the insurance company. Each time a positive test is reported, the form should be updated and provided to your insurance carrier. And with this information, they can assess whether an outbreak has occurred. Following the webinar, we'll again make these tools available to participants. And should you have questions, please feel free to reach out to a Sequoia Risk Advisor. And finally, whenever you have questions about a workers' compensation claim scenario, whether you should or shouldn't file that claim with your insurer, or any other questions about your employer workers' compensation obligations in California, you should always reach out to your insurance carrier. They're most specific with the construct of your policy, as well as their reporting and claims handling procedures. Each insurer is going to process intake claims and questions a little differently, but it's also, just important to make sure in anticipation of maybe these types of claims coming, that you've got their 800 claim reporting number on hand, their claim reporting email address, and the online reporting website ready in the event that you might need them. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Steve Kim and let him cover, some of the other employer kind of pieces of things you guys are going to need to be considering.
Great, thank you, Suzette. Thank you, Wilson Sonsini. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to put some of this into practice. I'll hint at what we're doing in the product, and I'll try to be brief so that we can make sure that Roland has enough time to demo the product. So if we move forward, I think just for background, right, I think everyone knows this by now, working in a COVID pandemic is a regulated industry. There's regulations by state, county, federal, guidance from agencies. And so what we've tried to do at Sequoia, what I've tried to do for ourselves is to distill it, because it can feel overwhelming if you try to synthesize all the information out there and all the requirements. It's hard to know kind of where to start. And so important to define things into a policy, and that's what Wilson, Sonsini, and 650 have done. Make sure you have your worksite safety plan, training decks, and sort of a game plan to move forward. But this is a highly fluid situation, and so along comes these two new laws, and it kind of upsets the apple cart. We have to go back and think about how to handle it. And so for me, as I was starting to dig into these laws, so we can go in more further, I think to me the laws make sense. So if there is an increasing number of cases, it's probably reasonable to assume that people have been getting it at work if they've been coming into the workplace. Now, while that might feel reasonable, I think getting to some of the practicalities can be complicated. As simple as, how would you know that someone has gotten a positive PCR test? I personally, if I had to go and do the math to get to the denominator of the number of employees, I'd have to go ask somebody or access the system, let alone measure the numerator over time. And then also the simple fact of being able to interpret test results to know if they're positive or negative, given that there are so many testing providers out there, makes this a pretty complicated enterprise. And so if we go one more further, I think what we've tried to do is to, and Roland will show more of this, is to make the compliance and the activity, the execution of compliance with these laws simpler, right? So at the core of it is you need to know who has been PCR tested before all the other obligations accrue. And so in our product, for example, we have daily questionnaires, you can track symptoms, you have the ability to have employees upload test results so that the administrator on the company side of the dashboard can kind of see where you are against those numbers. We're working on dashboards so that you don't have to do a lot of math. You can just sort of see when you're getting to outbreak levels. And then we're also looking at partnerships. So if you don't feel qualified to look at test results from CVS, Walgreens, One Medical, and others, we're going to try to put in place some partnerships to help you do that. So that's on the outbreak side. If we move forward, so Marina talked about the rebuttable presumption. So if you're in a position where you have hit outbreak level and you feel for some reason that that the cases haven't happened at work, you need to have some basis to do that, right? So the questions are, one, you have to be able to count the positive cases, but then what other sort of evidence might you have to say that, oh, this person might not have actually come to the office? And so if we click one more forward, so with our software, again, because you can track test results and symptoms, that gives you some basis. Some of the functionality that I think Roland will show, you can design cohorts. So those are the groups of people and only those groups of people who are allowed to come into the office. And so if someone reports sick and they aren't in that cohort, you have some basis to challenge that if that's what you want to do. And then we're also working on a feature where you can have employees QR code in when you come in, and that'll be reflected in our dashboard. So you have some further evidence to say who has actually been in the office and who hasn't. And then finally, on the reporting side, again, this is all about making sure you have access to all the information you need to report to the workers' comp admin. And as Marina noted, and it's here on the left side, you need to know things like what was the data that the assessments were taken, and what was your highest level of employees in the last 45 days. These things aren't necessarily easy to find, but through our software, we're working on ways to have that presented to you so that you can get on to the important work of notifying the workers' comp admin. Okay, so that's 1159 and a little bit of what we're doing at Sequoia. We'll switch to 685. And again, so this is more about notices. And again, there's a recurring theme here, right? Everything is triggered off of positive test cases. And so you don't want positive indications of PCR tests coming into you by email. That most certainly would not be a secure, HIPAA compliant way to do it. And so what we've tried to do in our software, again, and this is a recurring theme, making sure that the administrators at the company have a way to validate when you have a case so that now you can start complying with the laws. So again, test load capability, and we're working on some partnerships with test providers so that if the employer so chooses, those test results with employee consent can come directly into our system, and you don't have that time lag before someone actually uploads the test results themselves. So now, you know, if the bad happens and you do have to notify people, there is a set of information that you need to provide, right? It's the second paragraph there. You have to summarize all the benefits that might accrue to that individual. You have to describe anti-retaliation, discrimination, protections, et cetera. And so, you know, how to do that without having in a moment of high stress to go try to find all the information, encapsulate it, and then figure out who to notify. We're trying to simplify that as well. So what Roland will show is we have some contact tracing capability. So using our cohort system and reservation system, you can easily see who was scheduled to be in the office. And now you have some sense of the group that you might need to notify for potential exposure. And then, you know, some of this does feel theoretical with all the information that you need to include in the notice. And so we're working on a set of templates so that you know exactly what needs to be disclosed, and hopefully you can find the sources of information and push it out to, again, our messaging capability to the platform a little bit more easily. And then similar to, there is this obligation, as Marina said, this is the 3-person outbreak rule to notify local health authorities if there's a 3-person outbreak. And then again, this is all about accessing information and making sure you have a simple template to use to do what you need to do. So then to go to this last slide before I'll turn it over, just to summarize, again, I think some of the key principles: testing, accessing data, making sure you have at your fingertips all the information to populate these notices. And then of course, most importantly, making sure you have the access to care and guidance at the individuals who feel ill or might have been exposed, to make sure that those are all available to you. And those are the things that we've been concerning ourselves with at Sequoia, and hopefully have some solutions to help with that. And to show that more specifically, I will turn it over to Roland.
All right, great. Thanks, Steve. So Steve gave us the high-level overview of what our return to work platform includes with respect to meeting the new 685 and 1159 obligations in California. And I'll walk us through what this all looks like in our return to work center here. And oh, wait, hold on. All right, forgot to put up my mask on here. Okay, so now we're ready to go. All right.
What a ham.
For those of you who've joined, you know, some of our past webinars, all right, this starting point will look very familiar. Let me share my screen here. All right. All right, so this is where, you know, we start by activating the Return to Work Center here. All right, so you go ahead and activate your Return to Work Center. And this is, we'll start by setting up our different counties here. So set up our country. Set up a country manager for your company. You can add in your individual locations here. You know, put in the address, set a safe workplace capacity. So we use 100 here for this particular location. You know, decide who's going to be your location manager, who will have access to all the information there. appoint a medical record access person who would be able to see individual question responses if they need to see individual people's responses, but other people who don't have this role won't be able to see that information, so they're screened off. And then, assign a shift manager who can go ahead and, review and approve requests for reservations to come into the office. All right. Okay, let me move on here. All right, so we go to the next slide here. Next page, we can set up our shifts. If you have morning shifts and afternoon shifts, you can define those. And then go ahead and you're ready to start creating your cohorts. So like Steve mentioned, if you have cohorts that are people who come in on a consistent schedule every week, so like a Monday, Tuesday, Friday, let's say, these are people who would only be exposed really to each other most of the time. You can define those and go ahead and create that. You can assign a name to the cohort, assign a cohort captain here who would be responsible with following up for folks if they need to complete their screening questions. And then here you can define your onboarding preferences. So if you want to ask folks that take a COVID test, right, before they come back to the office, you can set that up here. And then once you're ready there, you move on and select who all are going to be part of your cohort. Add those people for the cohort. You define your screening questions that you want folks to see on their mobile app each day and answer those screening questions. And once you have that, you've set up the cohort, and you can go ahead and activate the cohort here. And then what the folks on the mobile app would see when they first log in would be this, accept the consent to return back to the office. Accept that. Go ahead, they can start doing, the process of onboarding and ask for that initial screening. For kicks here, I'm going to just say, yes, I tested positive. It'll ask me to upload a test result. And then I can just, if I have a photo of it on my phone, I can add that from my phone. All right, and at that point, my onboarding is complete. The admin would be able to go in here, look at these screening verifications, right? So we'll go into here. I'm not going to open up the document, but this is where you'd come and open up the documents and decide to approve or reject that COVID test result. And then once you've set up your cohorts, you can move on to setting up folks for reservations as well. So for reservations, these are folks who are coming in more on a kind of ad hoc basis. Might be Monday, Tuesday this week, might be Thursday, Friday some other week, right? It's not a fixed schedule. And so folks who want to be able to come into the office on demand, essentially, you'd first start here by setting up your office location for that. You gotta set your office, define whether reservations are auto approved, define, how many hours ahead of time you want to send your screening reminders. And then you can also configure whether you'd like folks to acknowledge, some sort of policy or document first, and then set up your screening questions. And so once you're done with that, then folks, on their mobile app can go ahead and, if they come into the office, Steve mentioned that QR code. We do have functionality here where they'd be able to go ahead and kind of scan, let's say, a poster of a QR code, and either at the front door or maybe even different parts of the office to register where they've been in the office, and that would get recorded. And then they can also use the mobile app to then set up their reservation. So go ahead and pick a location, pick a date and time. All right, pick the time, submit my request for a reservation, and it goes, and I'm approved for the reservation. All right, and so once you have the reservations in, you can also see the history, see kind of who all's been in the office on a given day. All right, and so that's kind of this is what all the information that then powers the next tab that we'll go to here, which is our compliance section. So this is where really all the stuff that Marina and Steve have talked about comes together in the platform. So we got the compliance in here. You can go ahead and be able to view, who all has confirmed cases the last 14 days. All right. See, these folks have had cases. I can click in, trace, what's going on with John here, who's tested positive. You can see his, kind of employee information. Had a positive test recently. You can also see, his past test results. Were negative in the past. And I see which cohorts he's been in contact with, kind of at the same time in the office, and then also what employees he's been in contact with. And then also on any given day, I can click in and, see, the specific folks for that day. All right, so a lot of information available here to really understand who all may have had exposure to this person. And then you can go into the compliance section here. You're able to customize a message to notify employees at risk, right? You can also deactivate your cohorts who are at risk here, as well as access templates for the outbreak notification and the workers' comp notifications that Steve mentioned earlier. And so the templates would be available here to for you to download and then upload. All right, and then on the lower half of the screen, you have the discussion of we need to know how many folks have been in the office over the last 45 days and what's the maximum number here. So you can see that trend, daily trend of how many folks are coming in, what's the peak in terms of folks coming in, and then also get information about specific days and who screened with warnings, who had confirmed cases, etc. here. All right, and then moving on from there, on the policy section, this section, very similar to before, you can upload your individual location policies here, and then go ahead and share it with the appropriate people by, just kind of pushing the button there. And then lastly, we have, resources. So they have links to, different articles in the feed, as well as access to different playbooks, as well as, testing and guidance resources. So like links to, county, testing, sites, etc. And then lastly, last tab here is just, a little view on number of employees who have completed onboarding. Right, you can see of those, how many have actually, been assigned to be part of a cohort, and then how many folks have been actually coming in on different days here. And so that's the cohort side. And then on the reservation side, you can see how many reservations you have, that kind of went through, how many, expired, how many got canceled. And that's our tour today. All right. Well, that's our quick tour. Let me turn it back to Michele here. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Roland. That was really cool. Let me get back on screen. Thank you. I appreciate it. And, hopefully folks out there, whether you're in, formal evaluation mode or not with software, I think it's very informative to see how this is being handled in software, because I think we all agree, like, it's not going to be solved in Google spreadsheets and Excel, needs to be a lot more formal and a lot better organized. And now that you have this compliance component of it. So hopefully, you learn more about really the needs and the response through even seeing how it can be solved in software. I hope you found that useful. So let's go to Q&A. And I did receive a couple, so thank you guys for that. Let's see, we'll start with, how about one from Marina? So Marina, do you think, and perhaps when do you think other states will start to have similar rules to California's, 685 and 1159? And you may be on mute, Marina, sorry. There you go.
Sorry, there you go. Especially with regard to 685, there is some expectation that we'll see some legislation following California's rules on this. The issue of, contact tracing and an employer's obligations to notify potentially exposed individuals that another employee has tested positive for COVID is murky. I mean, you have the obligations under OSHA, the general obligation that applies to most employers to provide a work environment that's free from known or recognized hazards. And you can, see what flows from that. Well, if I know that there's an employee who actually has COVID, and I know that there are employees who worked around that employee at the work site, shouldn't I have an obligation to notify and to conduct contact tracing to provide the notifications? And of course, there are recommendations from the CDC, but we get a lot of questions from a number of jurisdictions from clients who ask that question. We have a person who tested positive. Must I? Am I required to notify people? And how far does that go? And in what time period? So whenever you have gray areas like this with the overlay of the recommendations from the CDC and the general obligations under OSHA, it's calling out for legislation of the kind that California has implemented to make clear what the notification obligation is. So We expect to see other jurisdictions follow suit to provide clarity in this area. And of course, even without that legislation, because of the general obligation under OSHA and various mandates that may be on a local level or beyond in various jurisdictions, it certainly is an excellent idea to have a process in place whereby you can provide and prove that you provided notification to those employees who may have been exposed to a person who's tested positive for COVID.
Cool, thank you. Let's see if we can get one or two more in here, maybe one for Suzette. Suzette, just from a workers' comp claim standpoint, have there been any trends in the claims that are related to COVID? Like what do you see spiking, and do you think that's going to impact premiums moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we're still in early days in terms of the number of claims that are coming out of kind of non-first responder industries or retail. Certainly when we look at industries related to kind of office work, those claims have been much slower, thankfully, to develop and be reported. We are seeing certainly claims in the healthcare space, in hospitality, grocery workers. There's a lot coming out of those areas because of just the interaction with the public and the sheer number of days that people are in contact with each other. So yes, we are expecting to start to see insurance premiums rise. What clients will see first, though, is as they come up for renewal, there is now what is called a COVID supplemental application that insurance companies are requiring policyholders to complete. And it really details out what you've done as a company to prevent or eliminate or mitigate any of these COVID exposures. So what are you doing from a planning perspective? Have you been completely closed this entire time? If you've reopened, you know, what does that look like? How many people are on site? Things like that. Certainly the more work that is done, certainly utilizing tools that protect, you know, your employees, that you're able to track and provide feedback to the insurance company, that will give them a better sense of how prudent you've been in this, and will offset some of those general premium increases that we'll expect to see across California related to just the unexpected influx of COVID claims.
Right. Thank you, Suzette. We're going to have to leave it at there. I want to make sure to get everyone out on time. But looking at the chat there, we have a bunch of questions. I know some of the folks on the panel today have answered some of them directly in there, so hopefully people got the urgent questions answered, and we'll certainly do our best to follow up and get you something back on those. Thank you to all of you, our panelists today. Appreciate you always bringing your wisdom and insight and translation abilities to make this good for all of us to understand and to make useful. Appreciate that. Again, quick reminder and plug, go check out the Return to Work. Roland, you did an awesome demo. You can see more of Roland and his team. The great work that Vivek Rajan and his team are doing on the product side for this. Go check it out, hit that link. And just want to give a quick plug, our next Return to Work webinar in December. Right now, we'd like to do something as like a client panel and bring some of those clients using the product to the circle and talk about some of the decisions and discussions and strategies they're applying with the product. So I think that'll be a very interesting, useful conversation. So anyway, thank you all for tuning in. Always great to have you. Look forward to talking to you soon. Go have a great Thanksgiving, recharge, be with your families, be well, and we'll do this again soon. Thank you.